the American founders, to the extent that they were founding something new, were founding something new with an eye to a very long history, where this had been tried and retried and tried and retried and refined, and so they're sort of getting the separation of powers and the checks and balances really fine-tuned from all of the experience throughout the ages, starting from the Greeks and the Romans.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka and Tom Saruf.
Today we're joined by Susan Hanssen, who is a professor of history at the University of Dallas. She received her graduate degree in history from Rice University in Houston, Texas, and her undergraduate degree in history from Boston University, where she graduated summa cum laude Phi Beta Kappa. During the summer of 2008, she was an adjunct professor for the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation at Georgetown and was the 2010-2011 Garwood Fellow at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. She's also a longtime ISI speaker and teacher at the ISI Honors Conference, where she talks about everything from Britain's role in shaping American culture, American literature, Russell Kirk, and much more. And for this Thanksgiving-themed episode, she's joining us to talk about the Pilgrims, the Puritans, and Thanksgiving. So, Dr. Hanssen, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. I love Thanksgiving, my favorite holiday.
It is a great holiday. We just had the ISI team Thanksgiving in the new Linda L. Bean Center a couple days ago, and we read George Washington's Thanksgiving Day Proclamation, which is one of my all-time favorites. So it's an incredible holiday. And this episode will be coming out just a couple days before Thanksgiving. So I'm curious if you could, set the scene for the audience. Who are the Puritans? How did they fit into the British landscape before they came to the United States? And how did this holiday of Thanksgiving begin to emerge?
Right. Well, so there's a lot going on in Great Britain in the 1600s that sets the stage for the 1620 voyage of the Mayflower. And a lot of that is the result of the destruction of the independence of the church from the state. And so a lot of the groups that came over to America in the 1600s, whether it's the Puritans, whether it's the Cavaliers who came to the South, or the nonconformists who came to the mid-Atlantic colonies, and even the Scots in the 1700s, all of them were really coming over because they objected to the growing power of the British state, which would eventually become the power of the British Empire. So the Puritans particularly objected to the power of the king over the church and the fact that the king had the power to appoint bishops. Okay. That was sort of their big complaint, right? Very quickly, however, the whole thing turned around, and there was a Puritan revolution, Puritan civil war in England, and the Puritans became the majority in the Parliament in England, and then Parliament started making laws for the Episcopalian Church, and so the Episcopalians didn't like that, so they came over to the southern colonies. And then once the king and the Parliament, kind of got their act together in the late 1600s, and they were imposing on all of the different groups that wanted the independence of the church, whether it's the Methodists or the Baptists, the Quakers, the Shakers, the Catholics, the Unitarians, all of those people started coming over to the colonies as well. So what we see as the Pilgrim voyage, right, the Pilgrim voyage of 1620, is really iconic of a larger movement. It's not just one small group of people. But the Pilgrims were different from the Puritans because the Puritans wanted the British Parliament to impose Puritanism on everyone, whereas the Pilgrims were very adamant about the independence of the church from the state. And as I say, they weren't alone in that sentiment, and then that idea of the independence of the church, the liberty of the church, the freedom of the church, has been a theme in American history ever since.
And can you clarify a bit more about the how the relation of Puritans to the theme of liberty generally is, and not just religious liberty, which you sort of said they want to have Puritanism for everyone. I remember taking a class on freedom in U.S. history, and we talked about the Puritans, and I didn't get very much of a sense of burgeoning religious freedom the way that we talk about today. But explain more like the religious principles and beliefs of the Puritans and how that fit within that British landscape, and then how they think about liberty generally in this sort of new place that they're going to.
Right. Well, I think the most important thing is that sometimes we think of the Puritans so much trying to create a kind of city upon a hill in New England, trying to kind of create a perfect society, the perfect Puritan society up in Massachusetts. But the Pilgrims were very clear about the distinction between the government on earth and the kingdom of heaven that was to come. And they didn't have the same kind of utopian vision for what they were going to be doing in the New World. There's a wonderful line from William Bradford about the 1620 voyage of the Mayflower, where he says that they knew that they were pilgrims, and they didn't pay too much attention to what were the circumstances going on here. He said they lifted up their eyes to the heavens, which was their dearest country. And I think that theme of the city on earth, but also the city in heaven, and that we shouldn't have excessively utopian aspirations for our country here. We should be conservative of its best principles. We should try to reform it to the best of our ability, but we shouldn't expect that at any point we're going to have the ultimate revolution and then have the perfect political regime. That those kinds of utopian hopes have really proved themselves to be very damaging. Obviously, in the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, in many of the revolutions in Latin America, that kind of utopianism is not really part of the character of the Pilgrims. They were great believers in original sin, and that every generation you're going to have freedom, but every generation you're also going to have original sin, and so you're never going to have the perfect regime with all of the perfect people. So,
and even if you go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, as a quick follow-up to that, since you mentioned the city on the hill, I think it's a sermon by John Winthrop. I remember, I know a lot of ISI students read that. I read that at ISI at some point. Because as it's a religious sermon, that line is very important. It gets recycled and reused as a great testament of American identity and inspiration. But something that stands out from the very beginning of that sermon is there's all this basically economic teachings. There are rich and poor, and everything is owed to God, and what do you owe your neighbor, and all of these sorts of questions and answers. So I'm wondering if you can contextualize this sort of great line that gets taken, I guess, not out of context, but it's sort of the rest of the context doesn't matter in light of this like one beautiful line that's used in various times and places. So you'd say a bit more about how the model of Christian charity sermon fits within the Puritans and the early Americas.
Right. So I think that especially in the 19th century, the Transcendentalists kind of did what they wanted with the Puritan heritage. And the Transcendentalists really were sort of Hegelian optimists about the progress in history towards the perfect state. The Hegelian sort of Das State is going to be coming upon us in the future. As I like to say, as the Beatles always say, that things are getting so much better all the time. They're getting better all the time. That was a Beatles song, about how we're always progressing towards a better state. And I think that the Transcendentalists, looking back at the Puritans, really kind of hijacked that idea of a city upon a hill, whereas the actual Pilgrims, the actual Puritans, were very much Christian realists about human nature. They believed in sin, they believed in virtue, they believed in the necessity of a kind of constant moral struggle against one's own excesses. And they didn't think that you could create a regime that would work without virtuous and religious people, as Henry Adams, sort of John Adams, one of the many Adamses that have that Mayflower heritage in them, would talk about. This, you can't create a government that's going to run without a virtuous and religious people.
Susan, on the topic of the holiday of Thanksgiving itself. In terms of the origin, I'm curious, when it was begun celebrated nationally, was this something that was initiated by Washington? And did the original Thanksgiving that this is hearkening back to, was it at some point in history, was that sort of a mythology that, I mean, I'm sure many people would say today that sort of is a whitewashing of the past, sort of this harmony between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims. Can you talk about how the holiday came to be, but also what the original holiday was actually like?
So in some sense, you have to think of a whole multiplicity of national days of Thanksgiving and national days of penance, national and state governments having their own state day of Thanksgiving and day of national penance. And I think it's good for us to remember that they had both. That George Washington was always talking about the fact that we have so much to be grateful to God for, that divine providence has blessed our country enormously, and that we have to recognize that and give due thanks to God. But they also gave us national days of fast and penance for the sins of our nation, and that's maybe fallen off the map a little bit, but even Thomas Jefferson, who himself was not a devout Christian, but he says he trembles for his country when he remembers that God is just and that his justice will not live forever. So in this panoply of days of Thanksgiving, national days of Thanksgiving, multiple days of Thanksgiving, and multiple days of penance, you have a kind of narrowing down and specifying it. And then it really is Abraham Lincoln in the midst of the American Civil War, who decides that there will be one national day of Thanksgiving that will be on the 4th, the last Thursday of November, which is particularly beautiful because the month of November, while it is a harvest month, and so we are grateful to all of the blessings that God has given us, that he has prospered the work of our hands. One of Lincoln's favorite Psalms, Psalm 90, prosper the work of our hands, O Lord, prosper the work of our hands. So it's gratitude for all of the blessings that we have received during the past year. But it's also, in the context of the Civil War, a gratitude for the Civil War dead, gratitude for those who have given their lives for our country. So November is not just a harvest month, but it's also the month of the dead, the month of dead leaves falling off of the trees. It's a time for visiting cemeteries. Lincoln opened the Gettysburg Cemetery in the month of November, and there was this sense that November was a time for being grateful to all that the dead had handed on to us. And so I think there's a real resonance there with that beautiful line from Edmund Burke, when he says that society is indeed a contract, but it is not a contract in some low concern like the sale of tea or coffee, but it is a contract in all art, a contract in all science, a contract in all knowledge, a contract in all virtue. And because the ends of this contract cannot be achieved by a single generation, it is a contract between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. And so I think Thanksgiving, where we gather all of the generations around the table, and we're remembering the dead, and the older family members are telling us stories, of maybe the immigrants who came over here, and started the Italian restaurant on the Mexican border or whatever, telling the story about how their Irish grandmother was willing to marry, a Polish grandfather, even though the Irish didn't really like the Poles, telling these old stories to the next generation and passing on that gratitude and those principles to the next generation. I think that Lincoln giving us this in that context really kind of gives it that resonance.
We're obviously talking about Thanksgiving, but just you were talking about contracts, and I know we're talking also about the Pilgrims, and so it's the Pilgrims, they signed the Mayflower Compact in 1620, and I'm wondering if there's any of the sort of Burkean language or the sort of idea of an intergenerational compact that's in the Mayflower Compact, or in the sort of thinking of the Pilgrims when they're basically forming a society, but also the role and the import of the compact for not only their time, but also how that relates to and is infused into the America as we know her today from 1776 on.
So there certainly is this sense among the Pilgrims of this intergenerational connection. because a large part of the impetus for the Pilgrims coming over was concern for their children. They had already moved, the Pilgrims had already moved from England to the Dutch Calvinist Republic, but they felt that their children were being swept away by a much more secular culture there, and that they weren't able to actually pass on to their children the values that were important to them. And so really, in some sense you could say they came to America for the sake of the children. They just realized we can't raise our children here in this kind of a secular culture. And so they came for the liberty to raise their children as they thought was proper. So that's also a beautiful connection to today, I think, with all of the parents that are very concerned today for their parental right over their children's education, their children's upbringing.
Susan, could you explain a little more about the connection between the influence of the Pilgrims and the Puritans on the political theory of the American founding and the Constitution, and their legacy on politics at the time of the founding, but maybe even extending throughout American history?
Right. So, well, I mentioned the idea that they had a very realistic view of human nature, and that they didn't think that human nature was perfect. Yes, man was rational, but he wasn't perfectly rational. Yes, man was free, but he was subject to his passions, a slave of his passions, they would have said. And so they had a deep realism, and you see that element in the American founders very clearly. I think particularly in the figures of James Madison and John Adams. James Madison, sort of famously says, we have to build a government that can work despite the fact that men are not angels, right? And you can't expect, the government to run only, with sort of angelically perfect creatures. They also didn't believe that you could change human nature, right? That the regime could change it to such an extent that it would be perfect in the future. They had a very, as I say, a realist vision. You see this also in George Washington, who was by no means a Puritan. He came from the other end of the spectrum. He came from the Episcopalian and Cavalier immigration to the southern colonies. But he also had this sense that there were the laws of nature and of nature's God, and that these things were fixed, and that you can't change those things from age to age or with technology. His understanding of God was not simply a kind of deist determinism in history, but also the oversight of a good God. Providence was always his favorite word for God. Providence, who had given us the laws of nature and nature's God that we would have to obey from generation to generation, that those things don't change. So that kind of sense of a fixed universe and a fixed human nature with fixed natural rights, a fixed natural law, was very typical of the entire American founding generation. It really isn't until later, I mentioned the Transcendentalists, it isn't until we get a later injection of German Hegelian philosophy in the late 19th century that you really start to have people seeing the universe as something kind of fluid that can be, utterly transformed, right? But the Puritan realism and the sense of a fixed nature and and the need to conform to nature rather than attempting to create a sort of malleable nature, I think is very typical of the American founders.
Speaking of John Adams, you've mentioned a couple times. He's a Massachusetts man. I am also originally from Massachusetts. And he's very important as one of the original, one of the second president, first vice president. He wasn't at the Constitutional Convention because I think he was in England, England. But he wrote his famous, I think it was a multi-volume. It was a very big work on on constitutionalism and constitutions. So how does his sort of upbringing as a Massachusetts man have a particular influence on the founding? Because I also know later, after he loses the election of 1800, he later converts to Unitarianism, which is, I think, quite different from Puritanism and that sort of heritage. So what could you say about John Adams?
Yeah. So, well, I think it is a very good reminder. Maybe Thanksgiving itself is a good reminder that America has a very complex beginning. That we think of, sometimes people think of them all as, Anglo-Saxons, or white people coming over, right? But at the time, Puritans, Cavaliers, Nonconformists, and the Scots didn't think that they had a lot in common. So we had a very diverse founding, and so it is good to remember that America was not just founded by Southern slaveholders. That the Adams side of the story, where he grows up in a log cabin, he gets married to Abigail, they get a log cabin of their own. They have John Quincy Adams, born in a log cabin. Right? They're farmers. It's a very simple life. It's very impressive, I think, for people to go to Massachusetts, to go to Quincy, and to see the whole Adams historic district there in Quincy, where you can see the birthplace of two different presidents and the tombs of two different presidents there. So there's a kind of simplicity of their background. But the simplicity of their background does not mean that they were not educated. If anything, I think John Adams was the best educated of any of the American founders. He went to Harvard, and he wrote, as you said, this, I find it hysterically funny, this complete comprehensive tract on republics throughout history and in the thought of all philosophers, right? So he looks at aristocratic republics. He looks at democratic republics. He looks at monarchical republics. He looks at ancient republics. He looks at medieval republics. He looks at modern republics. And then he looks at what all of the philosophers have had to say about it. And then what all of the historians have had to say about it. I mean, so it is really comprehensive, right? Which gives you the sense that the American founders, to the extent that they were founding something new, we're founding something new with an eye to a very long history, where this had been tried and retried and tried and retried and refined, and so they're sort of getting the separation of powers and the checks and balances really fine-tuned from all of the experience throughout the ages, starting from the Greeks and the Romans, but onwards through the Florentine Republic, and the Dutch Republic. So John Adams, he contributes an element of very down-home, man of the soil simplicity, but at the same time, he was incredibly erudite. He really had studied deeply in political philosophy.
Susan, this could be a good segue to a recent ISI debate that you participated in, which was exploring the question of whether or not there's anything left to conserve in America. And you were arguing in favor, that there still is something worthy preserving here, that we don't have to start completely anew. And I think that's an important message, especially around Thanksgiving, because in the world in which we inhabit, I talk to a lot of, friends and relatives. I speak with a lot of ISI supporters, and there is sort of a unifying thread in all of these meetings, more so than ever before, even among sort of the most kind of normal, kind of people who are scattered all across the country, that they feel like, something bad is about to happen, like the country is about to come undone. They're so depressed that they have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning, and they're fearful for their kids. And I would, largely agree with them on probably all of those issues that are driving that anxiety. But there is a bit of a divergence now kind of in the conservative movement with people who say it's all, it's totally ruined. It's totally spent. We have to start over, either start over and refound according to the founders' principles, or we have to build some sort of new founding on, other, more ancient or more progressive principles. So I'm wondering if you can lay out your case, perhaps a case that's worthy of, having some hope during Thanksgiving about for what we still have to conserve here and why we shouldn't take that for granted.
I think that I should start by saying I'm incredibly sympathetic to people who really are terrified for our regime, and are amazed at the depths to which we have descended. And the idea of waking up and feeling a kind of paralysis, I really understand what people are looking at. It is a serious time, and at the same time, what I'm really struck by as a teacher is how much there is in our tradition to learn and to study and to grapple with before we imagine that we have the wherewithal to start from scratch. Our young people today, even our PhD educated middle-aged people today, right, do not have the kind of preparation needed to completely rework the American constitutional system. The people who are best prepared to help us to reform it are people who are deeply knowledgeable in its history. And I think that these kinds of ideologies, kind of radical ideologies, prey on the uprooted, the people who don't know very much history, who haven't studied really deeply in the primary sources, and they get kind of swept away because of their frustration. And that's something that we learned. We learned from the Cold War generation. We learned from Czesław Miłosz, the famous Polish poet laureate. In his book, The Captive Mind, he describes his 4 best friends and how, because they had no hope for the future of their regime in Poland, they lobbed onto the 2 attractive revolutionary movements, one from the right and one from the left. They lobbed onto Nazi fascism, or they lobbed onto Soviet communism, and it's an incredible read. It's just 4 chapters about his 4 friends and their intellectual trajectory, where they became so despairing of their current situation that they got swept up in a kind of ideological demand for absolute utopian change. And I think that the wisdom of Russell Kirk at that same time in the 1950s, the Captive Mind by Czesław Miłosz and Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind are published almost simultaneously. But Russell Kirk's wisdom and prudence in trying to recover the Burkean element in the Anglo-American conservative tradition is something that we really don't want to unplug from.
During the debate, something you mentioned, and that was a very fun night. Thanks again for doing that. But something you mentioned was the power of a remnant, even if it's just something small, but it's something that we can latch onto. Tying that into what we've been talking about for about the past half hour, what is the remnant of the Puritans and the Pilgrims that endures not just from the founding period and the impact that it had there, like we've discussed, but today's remnant from the Puritans that we would want to hold on to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think if people reread the Jerusalem chapter in Russell Kirk's The Roots of the American Order, perhaps especially right now when people are kind of grappling with what we as Americans receive from the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, I think rereading that Jerusalem chapter, remnant is one of Russell Kirk's favorite words in that chapter. The idea that the Jewish people were never promised that they were going to be victorious, over all of these forces. They had a faithful remnant, right? And if you read the prophets, you can tell that the majority of the rulers of Israel and the majority of the Jewish people were not actually following the divine law. That's the whole point of reading the prophets, right? They tell us that the majority is not doing it, but there is this faithful remnant, right? That even when they're in exile in Babylon, teach their children and their children's children, right? The songs of Zion. And I think that's definitely the spirit of the Pilgrims in the American founding. And I think that's it's a good thing for us to keep in mind as we live out our lives as culture warriors, that we're not expecting at some point that the culture war will be over and we will have won. Right? That's as Christians, that's not what we expect. What we expect is that we will manage to form a remnant that will carry on. And those remnants have done pretty amazing things, you know, and I like to think of American history as a little sort of remnant moving westward, right? So you get, even before the American founding, you have people who secede in some sense from Harvard and start Yale because they think Harvard is too much of a party school and too secularized. So they start Yale. And then a group of them think that Yale has become too much of a party school and, too secularized. So they start Princeton, right? And then, you start to get the Bible colleges of the Midwest, right? And then you start to get, the colleges, I say all the way out to, Thomas Aquinas College in California, right? You're sort of like, they just keep, the remnant keeps going, right? So that's a great American tradition, that in some sense, almost every immigrant group who's come over here has been a remnant, whether we're talking about the Vietnamese or the Cubans, we're talking about Nigerians or Venezuelans, right? It's a remnant of people who are bringing over here the principles of freedom.
Well, on that note, we're out of time for today, but thank you so much for joining us, Susan. If people want to follow your work, where can they find you?
Well, I think maybe especially on this topic, the best thing to do would be to look at the 1620 project that they did a while back, and I have a essay there in the 1620 project about the Mayflower Project and the Adams family.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks again, and thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to head over to our website, isi.org/resources, to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, lectures, debates, study guides, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.